Welcome to Drinking on the Edge. I'm its host and co-producer, David Fuhrer. Joining me here at Drinking on the Edge, as he often does these days, is Matthew Mercier, the engineer, and Radio Free Rhinecliff is happy to be located in back of the Epicurean here in the village of Rhinecliff. I want to give a shout out to a couple of former guests here at Drinking on the Edge who've been so kind as to provide us with the wines that we're going to be enjoying today. That's Bartholomew Broadbent of his eponymous Broadbent Wine Company, and Kevin Pike of the nearby Shotzi Importing Company, also of Branchwater Farms. The episode, that's going to be all about cheeses with wines. And joining us here to share about that subject all the way from California via Zoom is Janet Fletcher, who is the author or co-author of more than 30 books on food and beverage, including Cheese and Wine, Cheese and Beer, and the Audible lecture series Cultured, the Epic Story of Cheese. Jenna publishes the weekly Planet Cheese blog, which I just received today, as I have for quite a while. This one's about blue cheeses, y'all. And she's taught cheese appreciation classes to thousands of cheese enthusiasts around the U.S., both in person and virtually. A former staff writer and cheese columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, she's received 3 James Beard Awards and the IACP Burt Green Award for her journalism. But her main contribution to the cheese world is providing a character reference for our other guest here today, and that would be Kate Arding and her application for a U.S. green card. So first of all, before we enjoy that wonderful segue, thank you for joining us, Janet.
It's my pleasure, David. Thanks for having me.
And back to this beautiful segue that Janet so eloquently provided, showing her journalistic skills there, is Kate Arding, who is the co-owner of the award-winning Talbott and Arding Cheese and Provisions in the village of Hudson, New York, where she operates with her wife, the renowned chef Mona Talbott. Kate is an internationally recognized authority on cheese with 30 years of experience in the farmhouse and artisan cheese industry, beginning at London's Neal's Yard Dairy, an old haunt of mine back in my London days. From there, she went to California, where she helped establish Cowgirl Creamery and Tomales Bay Foods. She also regularly judges at U.S. and international wine competitions and is a frequent presenter and keynote speaker. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much.
Very good. So before we avail ourselves of these amazing array of cheeses that Kate has kindly not only brought into the Radio Free Rhinecliff studio, but also provided Janet all the way in her home in Napa, California, we're going to have them talk a little bit about the history of cheese and wine pairings. Why do people, when they think about wine and food pairings, the first thing that comes to their mind is wine with cheese? So what's behind all this, Janet?
Yeah, I think it's a distinctly American thing. I have never in Europe had anybody make a fuss about which wine they're going to serve with which cheese. Usually it's whatever the local wine is, whatever the local cheese is. And of course, in Europe, so often cheese-making regions are also wine-making regions and vice versa. That's less true in the U.S. I think Americans but partly because we didn't have that long wine tradition, that we're a little bit unsure about it, and we want people to tell us what's right. So I think that's why Americans got into what's the right wine for that cheese or the right cheese for that wine. And I hope Kate and I think we'll both agree that there's a lot of individualism that goes into that choice. If it tastes good to you, it's the right choice.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think coming originally from Europe, one doesn't see nearly the same contortions, for want of a better word, of people trying to pair things to the nth degree. I think it's an interesting exercise, but I do think that Europeans tend to be a lot more relaxed about this historically and even these days. I think there is some foundation for wanting to pair wines and cheeses, as Janet said, from a similar region, but that's much more challenging in the US. But I also like to hope that as American population gets much more comfortable around the subjects of cheese and wine, that they also become a bit more relaxed and a bit more experimental. It's okay if it doesn't work, and maybe that's something we'll find out today too. Who knows?
It seems to me that in my experience, having lived and traveled in Europe, that there's, I completely concur with the both of you about that. There's less of a fuss being made to not only pairing wines with cheeses, but wines with dishes of any kind overall. That said, and you alluded to this, Janet, earlier on, is that in Europe, there's been more time spent in cultural developments having to do with food and drink. And so in that, it would make sense that if this particular red wine was being made in this particular part of, for example, Spain, then the lamb, which is well known to be one of the probably equally as tended to in Spain as is cow, then the lamb dishes are going to grow up, in a sense, along with the wines in that particular region, perhaps in a way that, in a, use the term organic sense, might not come to pass in a newer country that doesn't have the time passage to allow for these things to develop in a more natural basis.
Yeah, and the other thing is that for the longest time, wine was the safe thing to drink. It was safer than the water. And cheese was really a way of making milk safe. Mm-hmm. So both of these products developed as preserves, really. And what else are you going to have with your cheese? You're going to have wine because it's safe to drink, and it's what's at hand. It's what's in your cellar.
Your comment about wine being a safer beverage than water until water sanitary practices came into greater being in the 19th and then 20th century is something that I grew up in my beginning days with wine through my mentor in Stuttgart, Germany, Hammoud, who made me aware of this, and not only wine, but of course beer, because before Mr. Pester and his cohorts found out what these bacterium were, people were boiling water when they're boiling grains to make beers, which also dials into your Cheese with Beers book.
Yeah, we should do another segment on cheese and beer.
Gladly.
It's easier. It's easier than cheese and wine.
Yeah. We can do a part 2 later this year. I'd be happy to do that. So in that, there's also a mention of cheeses developing in Europe alongside the wines of the area. Taking my comment about, say, lamb in Spain and the various red wines in Spain growing up together, how do you view cheese and wine development organically in Europe? There's a few classic examples, some of which we'll be tasting here today. But how does that work for the both of you?
Janet, you want to take that?
One thing to point out is that I think one reason why cheese and wine go together and why there's a tradition of enjoying them together is because they both come from temperate regions. You don't make wine in the tropics, you don't make cheese in the tropics, or in really cold areas. You're not going to make either one very successfully because they rely on landscape and they rely on having a temperate climate. So I think that's why you look at the temperate zones of the world. For the most part, that's where you're going to find wine production and cheese production.
That's an excellent point. I never really considered that. Thank you for pointing that out. Let's say Mexico, which has a diversity of climates, but it's a warmer place because of its latitude locations. They're slowly ramping up their wine production, but I can't remember having any cheese that really lit me up in my time in Mexico. They have cows. They have plenty of cheese, but nothing at the level that I would have expected in the more temperate climate zones. Their wine's making some progress, but still it's often the latitude situation that affects that as well, yeah.
It's also interesting to talk about climate because, as we all know, things are changing, and there's a couple of cheeses that we're actually going to try today where the practices, for example, of the individual farm being able to produce entirely their own fodder for the animals is no longer possible because of climate change. So things are always evolving, and it's always challenges. And I think, just circling back to the point you were just making, one other factor, climate is a huge factor, of course, but I think one of the other things about this is that, and perhaps the reason that traditionally so many of these wines and cheeses heralded from Europe was because the populations need to be fairly, if you're in for example, an insurgent region historically, or always on the move in the sense of being nomadic, neither of those factors lend themselves to being able to produce wine or cheese in a way that is really sustainable.
Yeah, certainly it was the ability to be in one place and establish a herd of cows that allowed for cheese production, or plant vines. Plant vines if you think you're not going to be there 5 years from now.
Exactly. It's a long-term proposition.
Let's get right to the wines. Janet, you've had the wines in front of you just as we do here. Why don't you please, if you haven't already, pour yourself a taste of this bubbly that's coming from the Loire. It's a Command de Loire. Brut Nature, Zero Dosage, 2022.
Okay,
yeah, from Bois Bronson. Yeah, this was disgorged last April. Look at that. Okay, so it's a 90% Chenin Blanc and 10% Pinot d'Ennui. It is purported to be super dry, as was requested.
It's a beautiful color.
Yeah. Okay. That term crémant, I know it has more than one meaning. In this case, does it mean it's like lower pressure, or not necessarily?
In this case, Commandant, I'd forget about the exact specs, but it has to be a certain number of atmospheres in order to be that way. I suspect this is not the very top limit of pressure, should we say, in bubbles and all that. I think Cremant allows for some flexibility. All the Cremant appellation laws allow for some flexibility in France about this. I don't have that information at my fingertips, but I suspect it's not as high as 6 atmospheres, which is a pretty high level of pressure. It's probably more around 4.5, 5.
I get a lot of pear and apple fruit.
Yeah.
Which definitely befits the fact that it's mostly Chenin, yeah.
And a lot of acidity, which we want with this cheese that we're going to have it with.
Well, it's a good early in the day wake-up drink, to be sure. It is crisp, no doubt.
I'm getting quite a little bit of citrus, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if either of you are, but just on the... It's got a nice length to it.
What I'm looking for with this is, in terms of cheese and wine matching, is not so much the aromatics, it's the texture, the weight, and in this case, the bubbles, of course, are really important for our cheese match. But it's not the aromatics that, for me, are going to make the match successful or not successful. They add to the pleasure of the wine, but I don't usually find that's the link. Here it's that brisk mousse and the acidity that I think are going to make it a good match with this cheese we've chosen.
Yeah. You mentioned the body and the weight. For the uninitiated, there are 3 basic tastes we tend to talk about: bitter, sweet, and sour. And each are generally identified with a primary component of wine: bitter with tannins, sweet with residual sugar that might be still residing in the wine after its fermentation, and sourness or acidity. And then the 4th component, alcohol, is often identified with the perception of warmth or relative warmth in the back of the mouth, and is the primary factor in influencing the wine's body. Dry extract, that is the amount of residual dry extract remaining in the wine, is also a factor there. That's also something that can be measured, though it isn't as often as I think it should be by the producers and all that. And then the fact that worth noting is, for people who care about umami, I do believe that all wines are naturally low in umami, with the exception being perhaps of these young wines, to be sure, but with the exception of that probably being older wines that have had more time to evolve upon themselves.
Yeah. Umami is really related to protein, and so it makes sense that wine would not be characterized as having umami, in my view.
Yeah, the difference, a departure from that might be with wines that have spent prolonged periods in contact with yeast cells. And you can find that with some of the longer age, pre-disgorge age sparkling wines, and of course, older fortified wines, Madeiras, older sherries and such.
Umami is an interesting, I'm sure we'll talk about that more as we get to some of the more mature cheeses, but that to me is also a key factor in a wine choice. How much of that savory umami character am I getting out of the cheese? And I know we have some coming that are...
So we're actually kicking off with a cheese called St. Stephen, which is made a little to the north of here in Stephentown, New York, by 2 friends of mine, Shalina and Willie Bridgham. And they worked for years, both of them, at the old Chatham sheep herding company before they started their own business. And this was the first cheese that they made. It's a triple cream cheese, which means that there is cream added to whole milk. It's got a white sort of flossy rind, which technically is a Penicillium candidum rind. So it's the sort of same kind of rind you get on a brie or a camembert. And one of the reasons that Janet and I selected this style of cheese to go with the Cremant is that it's got a lovely sort of rich, obviously because of the triple cream, rich flavour, but it's not overly assertive. So it's a fatty, rich texture, and in theory, the combination of the effervescence, the bubbles of this wine should cut through the fat and make for a good combination. So in terms of tasting cheese, and Janet, please feel free to weigh in here, I personally like to taste the interior of the cheese first. The rind on any cheese typically is, any natural rinded cheese is going to taste stronger than the interior because it's been exposed to air and has oxidized in a way or formed a rind. I also like to see that the rind is very much part of the cheese. There shouldn't be too much separation. This is actually because it's been at room temp for quite a while, because I took it out earlier. You are starting to see this a little bit. But yeah, let's try it. So I taste the interior first, basically. Yeah, and then the rind is always going to taste a bit stronger because it's got more concentration of flavour.
Yeah, and it's mold.
Yeah.
That's what's on the outside. And mold is pretty hard on wine. I usually tell people, as you did, Kate, to try the inside first and then try it with the rind. You're going to have a different experience once you introduce that mold element. And it's maybe going to be not quite as pleasing with the wine.
Right.
But I think it's what the cheesemaker wants you to have the rind on a cheese like this, I think. They consider it part of the...
Yes, and I get on the cheese counter, I get asked this question a lot. Should I eat the rind? Unless it's wax or plastic, which should be fairly self-evident, but this is what I always suggest to people, is taste the inside or the interior paste first and then the rind. The rind on this particular wheel is a little thick, again, because it's been sitting out for a while, but so I think the interior lends itself more favourably to the wine.
Yeah, I think it's a nice match, but to me, what's pleasing about it is the textural contrast.
Exactly.
That you have something that's so creamy and fatty on your tongue, and then you have those brisk bubbles that just scrub your palate clean and get you ready for another taste.
And I love what you said, Janice, about the texture being more important than the flavour. I completely agree with this.
And sometimes you want to, instead of the contrast of texture, sometimes it can be fun to have an echo or a complement of textures. So sometimes with these bloomy rind, really super high-fat triple cream cheeses, it's fun to pair something like a buttery Chardonnay, because then you have an echo. You have a very velvety, mouth-filling, supple cheese with a wine with a cheese that's also very soft and buttery.
And that's more of a complementary than contrasting element. That said, your comments about the rind here is actually quite easygoing. It's not at all jarring on my palate. And it pairs well, just as well with the Bartholomew Comont de Loire as does the interior.
It is different, though, don't you think?
Obviously, the texture is going to be wildly different, but the flavor, not so much so. Yes, it's different, but the juxtaposition of the creaminess, super creaminess, and the firmness of the two-stage ripening of the interior of the cheese versus the outside of it right now texturally it's more diverse than flavor. It's not, again, people who the bitterness or acridness of a rind turns them off, they wouldn't find it with this. It's very mild, very easy to eat.
But it must be said that as a cheese like this matures and gets older along its lifespan, that rind is going to get strong. It's going to start to break down. It's going to start to get ammoniated. Mm-hmm. Of course, that's when you're wishing you hadn't bought it.
Yeah.
You probably shouldn't have bought it. But at that point, their cheeses it's close to over the hill. That's what happens with these kind of bloomy rind cheeses.
Yeah, that's true. And for reference, anyone who tells you that ammonia is good on cheese is incorrect. I never want to be selling a cheese that has ammonia on it. And I don't care how macho it comes across, it detracts from the cheese. Sometimes it can be, if you let it air out, it can dissipate. But I've been told too many cheese cans, oh, that's part of the cheese. No. Wrong.
Thank you for busting that in.
Not that I'm opinionated.
Now, I had the opportunity, having received these wines over the past few days, to open a few of them in advance, or two of them at least, in advance of our gathering. And this next wine might be a bit controversial, but let's taste and pour it. Kate and Matt, if I can get you to empty your white wine glasses here. And we'll put the next wine in.
So this is
Yes.
from South Africa. It's not a wine I'm familiar with at all. We don't see a lot of South African wines here in Napa Valley, but it's very dry. It leaves a very kind of dry impression. I'm glad that it's not super grassy. It's got something, a little bit of roundness to it for a Sauvignon Blanc. It's not super austere.
Yeah, it's actually settled in really nicely. I suspect the current vintage in the market, at least that was reviewed so highly by a famous media outlet, 2023, is a bit more expressive, I would think, as Sauvignon Blancs tend to be when they're really young. After a couple of years, they do settle into themselves. So this is actually very gentle, but still very dry and very taut, as a good Sauvignon Blanc, in my opinion, should be.
Got a little bit of a bitter finish, and not unpleasantly, but there's just a hint of bitterness in the finish for me.
I get that too. I'm glad you said it. So
Yep, it could be an early harvest or early-ish harvest to allow for that. Who knows? For those of you who are interested, this is from the Salt River Winery in the Western Cape of South Africa.
Is that a very dry region, or is it wetter because of the proximity to the ocean?
I think it's like most of the South African wine-producing areas, it's a relatively dry side. Yeah.
It also seems, I didn't look at the alcohol. It seems fairly low alcohol. I'm not.
It is reads out.
It's not 13.5, it says. Okay. It doesn't, it's not a, maybe I have that California palate where a lot of our wines are they're very full bodied. This does not seem like a big mouthful.
To my taste. By comparison to your standard California Sauvignon Blancs, especially Napa Valley, this is restrained. Certainly more what you'd expect from a medium level Sancerre or Pouilly-Fumé on that regard. It can hold the alcohol. This one certainly does. It's really well structured. Shall we move on to the cheese with it?
We're going to taste, this is a cheese from Corsica called Fleur de Maquis. And I'm just for the listeners, I'm going to describe it a little bit. It's a hockey puck size cheese. It's made from sheep's milk. And one of the things that really distinguishes this from a lot of other Mediterranean cheeses is that it is encrusted with herbs which are gathered from the same region where the sheep are grazing. It's a very dry, very arid region most of the time. And so it has this sort of slightly, to some eyes, scary appearance. I think it's beautiful, but it also tends to develop a fairly healthy covering of mold on the outside on top of the herbs, which can give some people slight pause for thought. But I'm going to hand this around. I love this cheese, and I think personally sheep's milk cheeses tend to lend themselves really well to wines because they have a lot of flavour without being particularly overly assertive. So with this one, to our earlier point, I definitely taste the interior first because the rind has these herbs on the outside. But the purpose or the idea behind coating them in herbs is to impart a sort of herbaceous flavour rather than to necessarily eat them straight up.
Yeah, I love this cheese too. It's a personal favorite.
Me too.
I love sheep cheese in general, but this is such an unusual one because it's got that. When people think of sheep cheese, they think of aged cheese like Manchego or Pecorino Romano or Pecorino Toscano. This one is it's semi-soft. It's buttery in your mouth. My husband and I went to Corsica about maybe 10 years ago, and I was so surprised to learn that they don't eat this cheese in Corsica. It's pretty much only for export. They don't want their cheese with herbs on it. But it's a modern cheese, and it was developed really for the export market. Some enterprising wholesaler in Paris had the sheep cheese sent to him, and he put the herbs on the outside, and it was a success. So now they do make it in Corsica and ship it out, but they disdain it.
That's so interesting. Smart business people. So what are they eating in Corsica? What?
They're eating a lot of sheep cheese, but it's different ages. I won't say it's generic, but it's either young, medium, or old, and they're delicious. They're delicious, and a lot of ricotta.
Oh yes, that would be. So this one of the things I love about this is when it's younger, it tends to have this sort of slightly springy, soft, springy texture. But then as it ages, it becomes creamier and a bit more yielding. And I think with this particular wheel, which I think we are tasting off the same wheel, just for reference, Janet, this is, I would say, on the cusp This is right between the two. So it's got a little bit of age on it, but it's not, it never goes runny, but it definitely becomes softer with age.
Yeah, but you really get those southern Mediterranean herbs,
Yeah.
thyme and rosemary and lavender, and it just all blends together into this herbaceous impression that I think is a nice liaison to Sauvignon Blanc. So going against what I said earlier about not being driven by aroma, I think in this case, the aroma is such a pronounced part of this cheese that it really does make you think of, let's pair it with something that has a little bit of that.
I think this wine works really well with it.
I'm with Kate on that. Janet, do you like the pairing?
I do. Because this is sheep milk and not, say, goat's milk, which is what we usually think of pairing with Sauvignon Blanc.
Sure.
It's got a little more, the sheep's milk gives it a little more of a buttery quality and a little more savory kind of lamb chop quality. So I think this cheese could go with a light red as well because of that herbal note and the savoriness. So
Well, we come back to it later with some of the light red lined up. I think this is a gorgeous pairing. Heartily recommend it. But then again, I also have a built-in bias for sheep's milk cheeses. Trust me, I like all kinds of cheeses, but in the aggregate, sheep's milk is always going to pull me a little bit stronger than cow, goat, or the less common, really outside milk sources.
A pairing guideline for me. If I like, we're seeing a lot of herbed cheeses in the marketplace these days. Marinated goat cheeses with herbs and goat cheeses with coatings, herbal coatings. I tend to look at a Sauvignon Blanc style, or that style of wine with these herbal herbaceous cheeses.
No.
Kind of a good pairing.
No, I cheated. I just went and had a taste of the white wine, the next white wine, the 2017 Louis Guntram Dry Riesling, to finish off having consumed the Rhine of that Fleur de Maquis. Not a great, but still an okay pairing. It did. I'd say it didn't clash, but it didn't necessarily add to it. But shall we move on to the Louis Guntram that I just mentioned? And along with the Salt River, I opened these last night and enjoyed them with my dinner without commenting too much about it. The Louis Guntram, which to me is noticeably oxidized, not to the extent that didn't see myself enjoying it. It appears to be oxidized from its brownish appearance, along with the aromas and the taste, but it's not such that I can't bring myself to enjoy it. And last night, the Sauvignon Blanc that we just tasted was okay with my dish. However, because of the way I prepared my dish, the oxidation actually in the Louis Guntram Riesling lended itself better than the Sauvignon Blanc to my dish, and I ended up drinking half the bottle along with my Corvina with lots of caramelized onions and shallots with tarragon and capers and all that, and olive oil. So that worked out really well. But again, for people who might find an oxidation to be kind of an impediment to enjoying a dry Riesling, I wanted to bring that out there. So Janet, your comment about the wine.
You wouldn't mistake it for anything else. It's just Riesling that some people call a kind of a petrol smell or sort of a rubber smell. It is just what Riesling is. And some people hate it. Some people love it. It's there. This is, I would say, a light Riesling. It's lightweight. It's dry. If you're expecting some sweetness, you're going to get very little. I find that oxidation actually appealing. It gives just a slight nuttiness. We'll see what it does with the cheese. But this is all told. It's a light-bodied wine with showing some age.
And what cheese are we pairing with that here?
This is one of Janet's favorites and one of my favorites. This is Omar, OMA, which is made by Sebastian von Trapp of Von Trapp family fame up in Waitsfield, Vermont. And the cheeses weigh about 1.5 pounds, and these are washed rind. So what that means is the cheeses are made, each disc is made, and then over the course of its maturation, it's physically washed with a brine, so a saltwater solution. And what that does is it creates a sort of orange coloured rind, which is a little bit tacky, a little bit sticky in appearance, quite aromatic. And one of the traits of this style of cheese is they often smell, the aroma is often a lot stronger than they actually taste. And is a note going back to our earlier conversation, these wash rind cheeses are one of probably the oldest styles of cheese known, because one of the sort of bastions of cheese making, certainly in Europe, were the monasteries. And a lot of times, and they were considered in war-torn medieval and pre-medieval Europe, monasteries were a place of sanctuary where travellers could know that they'd be safe at night, and the monks, and in some cases the nuns, if it was a comfort, would be producers of particularly beer, wine, and this style of cheese. And they would actually, instead of washing it with a saltwater solution, they washed it with beer. So I love this cheese. I love all cheese, but this is particularly good one. Matt, here you go.
It's tasting great. This is so exceptionally.
It's a really good one, isn't it?
It is a really good.
I know. When I was getting these ready, I would be lying if I said I didn't have a fairly hefty slice for myself.
Yeah, it's so meaty. It just reminds me of sausage.
Yes.
It's got this meaty, beefy, oniony flavor and aroma. And I'm so glad you brought up the monasteries. Somebody once said to me that the reason the monasteries made these beefy washed-rind cheeses is because they had so many fast days in their annual calendar where they couldn't eat meat. So they made these very robust cheeses to stand in meat. It
makes sense. I'd never heard that, but it completely makes sense. And for people who are listening, the texture of this is what we would call a semi-soft. So it's a little bit springy, softer than the previous one, the Fleur de Maquis that we tasted. It does have the capacity to go slightly runny, but I think it's better at this age. It's what I would call a yielding texture. I'm excited to try it with the Riesling.
Yeah. Cheeses like this, one flaw I often notice in them is bitterness, and I'm getting no bitterness whatsoever in this cheese. So this is the kind of cheese that would be made. Munster would be a sibling in the same family. Chimay from Belgium. These monastery cheeses that are strong and that are often eaten with beer or with a Riesling or Sylvaner or Pinot Gris. Varietals from Alsace and from Germany that are so compatible with this type of cheese.
For those listening who are perhaps less traveled in the cheese world, the Munster that Janet referred to is not the gorgeous Wisconsin fresher style, but the more classic one coming from Alsace, France.
Yeah, and this cheese can be a wine killer. Or this style, if it gets really funky. And
somebody once said it's not the sort of cheese you'd bring on a first date, but it's the kind of cheese you'd bring on a second date if the first one went well.
That's right.
Given the name of the cheese, there might be a grandmother who would beg to differ on that. Yeah, we'll see.
I think people might enjoy knowing his grandmother, and in Austria, in Germany. And Kate mentioned the producer's name is Von Trapp, and I know Von Trapp rings a bell with just about everybody of a certain age through the sound of music. And this is the same family. These people, the Werner Von Trapp, who came to the U.S. in maybe the 50s, was part of that family. He was a tenor as a young boy with the family chorale.
Yeah.
Is this the same family actually puts their name to the beer brand, Von Trapp?
I don't know beer.
There's a brewery, I believe, here in the Northeast called Von Trapp. We do see it on tap.
It's probably related, I would imagine.
Or under contract with them, who knows?
Yeah. I'm also really excited because, sorry to interrupt, but I just learned that this cheese, from almost since its inception, has been aged by Jasper Hill, its neighbor in Vermont, and very recently it's gone back to Von Trapp. They now have their own aging room, and so they're aging it themselves. And I was a little concerned that maybe they weren't going to be as expert at Jasper Hill as Jasper Hill is, but this piece proves that they know exactly what they're doing in that aging room.
Yeah,
it's a great cheese, and it's a great pairing with this. I would think that a younger, fresher, more razor edge style of dry Riesling wouldn't be as harmonious with this cheese as is the 2017. I think the selection by Beaulieu of the 2017 was a wise one. The oxidation actually adds to the suitability of the wine with the cheese. Janet, you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I think so. This wine is very high in acid, and I think that helps too to make the match because the cheese is very buttery. It's very fatty feeling. on your palate. And although there's not cream added, it has that just kind of supple butteriness. And you want the leanness of the Riesling to clean up your palate.
Let's move on, please. Jen, if you could please comment about our first of the two red wines we have with us today. It is Añejas, Old Amphora, wine from Di Martino. It's a Sanso.
Throwing a lot of unusual stuff at me here, laying wine.
Look, if I was pouring Napa Valley wines, you'd be bored. Yeah.
Yeah, since it's not something that is often bottled on its own, it's usually a blending grape. So I'm really not that familiar with its, what its innate nature is. Let's see if it does not look intense. It looks like a fairly medium weight wine, a light to medium weight wine just from the color.
It's worth mentioning the area this is from, the DotE of Chile, is renowned for having grafted old Sanso vines. The one from Di Martino, no less. I believe they were a pioneer in this aspect. And so what you're tasting here is certainly from ungrafted vines, old, no less, and vinified in amphora. So there you go.
Yeah, I get a raspberry note. I don't know if anyone else gets that. It has pretty aromatics.
And the raspberry note is characteristic of Sanso, to be sure, as is low tannins. And acidity, low to medium bodied on that. That's ticking boxes for Sanso.
Yeah. Easy drinking.
One thing just chiming in here, the peanut gallery, but one note about tannins that I think is really interesting with cheese, and particularly actually with the cheese that we just tasted, the Omar as a wash rind cheese, is that in my experience the more tannic wines and the reds are a horrible combination with wash rind cheeses. They tend to really
accentuate.
Fight. Yeah, it's really fight. So it's
essentially any presence of ammonia that's in the rind, eh?
Yes, and it also, this sounds rather strange perhaps, but it's for me it's a textural thing as well. It tends to get this just mush in it, and this is a very personal thing. I also go out of my way to tell people that there's no right or wrong, but I've just found that tannins really impact both positively and negatively cheeses in ways that one might not expect.
Well, to me, tannin is something that you just have to address with a stronger cheese, a cheese that has more intensity, more savoriness, more umami. I love wines with tannin. It's the structure, it's their backbone. And I very recently saw somebody's comment online that the reason red wines don't go with cheese is because cheese doesn't have any tannins. And red wine tannin. Oh, what? I mean,
I don't agree with that.
Makes no sense.
Pork doesn't have any tannins either. Lamb doesn't have any tannins either. And it goes perfectly well with robust red wine. So I think you just need to address the tannin with a cheese that intensity and a high savory.
And backbone, I completely agree. But for example, with something like the Omar that we just tried, it's a different flavor profile. It has a different oomph. It's a more gentle experience. Well, I agree with Janet.
Leading us back to the cheeses here, I'm happy to say that we have another sheep's milk cheese.
We do, hooray. So this is a really wonderful manchego, and not all manchegos are created equal, and by far the majority that make their way to the States are often coated in a sort of breathable plastic coating, which isn't inherently wrong or bad, but what it does is it creates a very different experience in terms of how the cheese ages and matures, because it's, with the best will in the world, it reduces the ability of the cheese to breathe during aging. It creates a very neat, yes, it's not completely anaerobic, but it definitely changes things. The thing about this one, which is from a producer called Queseria 1605, which is imported by Essex Cheese Company, is it's a completely natural rind, which is what one would see in Spain. And to me, the reason why that makes such a difference is that if a cheese can breathe as it matures, inevitably there's moisture loss taking place, and with moisture loss becomes concentration of flavor. And if the cheese is being made by a skilled cheesemaker, that is the difference between a cheese which is going to hopefully have great length of flavor, depth of flavor, but also balance, which I think is really important. I love this Manchego, and it's the best example, certainly in the US, that I've had.
It's for people who are familiar with Manchego, and these days I would say most culinary-oriented Americans are. This Manchego is quite separate from what you're generally going to be accustomed to. It's a much, in my opinion, more elegant Manchego. I haven't tasted Manchegos of this caliber in the United States. Yes, you can find this more often, this type in Spain, but it's hard to find this in the U.S., and I'm really glad that Kate brought it.
You can find it. You just have to go to a good cheesemonger. Yeah.
Such as Talbott and Arding in Hudson,
yes.
New York.
But also there are plenty of others, and anyone selling, the name of the importer is Essex Cheese Company, as I mentioned, and I have tremendous respect for them. They spend an enormous amount of time doing selection and tasting before they export. They know their producers, which is a very key component to this sort of type of relationship. And yeah, I trust them.
Janet, what's your take on the pairing of this with the Sanso?
This cheese is just a phenomenon. It is so good. It's the one I'm going to come back to for lunch. I can't stop nibbling on it. It just has that come back for more seductiveness. It's not, I think a lot of people think of Manchego as peppery and piquant, and it can be, and kind of sheet lammy. This one is not that. You get more nuttiness, more of almost a cheesecakey kind of flavor, that cultured sour cream sort of flavor. You let it sit on your tongue. It's just so seductive. Kane, do you have any idea how old this deal is?
I think this is about 4 months.
4 months.
4 to 6.
Okay. Uh-huh.
I think closer probably to 6 at this point. But this, I don't know about you, Janet, but I get almonds, raw almonds.
Yeah, there's definitely a nuttiness to it. And I asked about the age because I think especially with Manchego and other cheeses, age is a factor in your wine selection. You're going to see Manchegos in the market that range anywhere from 3 months to a year, and they are completely different cheeses. And with the younger 3-month Manchego, it's more buttery, and you might even think of a white wine with that, or a lighter red. But as you get into more age on the Manchego, they do get more savory, more piquant, and that's when I want that red wine with some tannin, a Rioja or a Ribera del Duero.
In the case, I would argue in the case of this particular Manchego, the Sanso is actually an excellent pairing. It might be swamped by your standard Manchego you'd pick up at most commercial operations.
It would.
But this is a different style of Manchego for those who are maybe expecting that more intense style. I think the pairing of the two together is quite good.
It's a very enjoyable wine. It's just very easy drinking. I could polish off a bottle of this very easily, and I could see it going with a lot of cheeses, even something on a brie style.
This next wine actually is maybe the only wine that has seen a second view here on Drinking on the Edge. I'm convinced when I had Kevin Pike here talking about wines of Switzerland with Jean-Luc Germanier tuning in from Switzerland. This is one of those Swiss wines we may have tasted, or maybe it wasn't Mr. Germanier, it was José Villamos, excuse me. We did taste this from Pinot Noir from Graubünden, and so that's what we have lined up next. Janet, your take on this Pinot Noir?
I haven't tasted it yet. So we have a Swiss cheese and a Swiss wine. Was that the?
That was what brought me to this. I thought, hey, come on.
Okay.
We got
here. We're gonna. I know there's room for some controversy, right?
That said, my experience with having had the wine before is it's a really good wine, and I was happy to have Kevin suggest it once again. Happy to bring it in, and the fact that it runs the pairing of Gruyere with wines runs a bit of a gamut, and for those of you who may have picked up on what Janet said, we had a little bit of pre-game chatter about what to do here. But that said, richer Pinot Noirs can be suitable with Gruyères, and the fact that this is a Swiss cheese and a Swiss wine, I thought, let's give it a shot.
The wine is delicious. It's soft. There's not much tannin to speak of. Very pleasant. It's got typical aromatics, but it's light. I haven't looked at the alcohol, but it does strike me as it's 13.7. It sure doesn't taste like that. It's very balanced. It's just a nice, easy drinking wine. We're going to get to this Gruyere, but so maybe I'll save my thoughts on the best wine for Gruyere until after we've tasted the cheese.
It's okay. Can you run us through this this lovely Gruyere you've provided?
Yeah, so this is very small production. This is made by Michel Speicher, who is a farmstead cheesemaker in Summerswald in Switzerland. He only makes about 5 to 6 wheels per day, and the milk comes from a number of small dairies, but they're all located within 1 kilometre of the creamery, and the cows are only fed on fresh pasture or on chop, which is a sort of silage during the winter. The dairy is called Fritzenhaus, which is really fun to say, and I love this cheese. You get, I don't know if you've had a chance to smell it yet, but you just immediately get these big brothy flavors, salted peanuts. It's not fruity. Some of these wheels can be, but this one isn't. I also get a little bit of damp or wet hay smell, and I'm really interested to try it with this wine.
Is this the gentleman who keeps winning the World Cheese Awards?
Yes, Gourmino. Yes. Oh, Gourmino is the importer, but yeah,
he's won like 3 times.
It's fun to be able to have the cheese on the counter.
So
What would be interesting for people is to buy a supermarket Gruyere and then compare it to this. They are not the same cheese. It's so classy, and I get a lot of roasted onion aroma, and like you said, that brothy. And so much length. I know wine people talk about length and long finish. This cheese has just a very never-ending finish.
When I was at Neal's Yard, my old boss had a wonderful expression relating to length of flavour, and he would refer to a cheese such as this as being a 4 or 5 mile cheese, meaning that if you put it in your mouth, jumped in the car and drove down the road, you'd be still tasting it 5 miles later. The clincher is whether you want to do a U-turn and come back for more. But it was a great way of remembering. For me, length and balance are so key with any food, really, but obviously particularly with cheese.
There's a bit. Please, Jenna.
Just, I want to say that I do find that it's working with the wine in the sense that it doesn't hurt the wine. The wine tastes just as good after a bite of the cheese as it did before. So I don't think it has compromised the wine in any way and made it taste metallic or bitter, which is what we're looking for when we do these wine and cheese matches. Is we don't want the cheese to change the wine. Cheese can make wine taste. It can wipe out the tannin. It can wipe out the aroma. It can make it taste metallic. And I don't find that it harmed the wine in any way. But it's not where my palate wants to go.
You want it to be on either an equal footing or to flatter the wine. I see where you're going with that. And coming from the wine world, I'm with you 100% on that. I agree with Kate. This is a very complex, happening in so many different directions. Cheese. I was concerned that this from Pinot Noir would get lost by the cheese, and it doesn't. It jostles a bit on my palate at first, but then it harmonizes beautifully, and I feel, wow, there's a lot going on here, coming and going, but it works. It all works.
Yeah, but I want to put in a plug for people to try this kind of cheese with something that echoes the nuttiness that peanut butter or almond character, roasted walnut character in the Gruyere. Then look at a cheese that has some oxidation, a wine that has some oxidation, like a dry Oloroso, sherry, a Madeira, some of the slightly oxidized whites from Eastern France, from the Jura. They're so good with these nutty cheeses like Comté and Gruyere.
I agree with Janet. There are some exceptional pairings in that lineup you just mentioned. Really good.
Avanzon, coming from not too far away, just over the border in France, would be absolutely appropriate with this, to be sure. And that said, a VOS or VRS, Palo Cortado or Oloroso from the likes of Barbadillo or Gonzalez Bias would be actually excellent with them as well. I wanted to pair Swiss. How often do we have the opportunity to do that with two great elements of food and drink? Yeah. Looking at the clock, we do need to move along. As gorgeous as this and illuminating as this time is with dry wines, we need to move on to a sweet wine and a blue cheese. Harkening back to my earlier comment about Janet's current newsletter bit being about blue cheeses. Kate, what do we got?
So we've got a very classic Roquefort, which is, this producer is Gabrielle Coulet, who is one of the greats. One of the things that distinguishes this Roquefort from some other producers is particularly the sort of velvety texture. It is salty. That is part of the profile of Roquefort. So in the sort of classic, it's assertive flavour. It's made with natural moulds that some listeners may have heard about, which are originated in the caves of Cambalou, which was the origin story really of how Roquefort came into being. It's a very upfront cheese. It is definitely assertive, and it's one of the reasons why it's always interesting to taste it in tandem with a sort of dessert wine or a sweeter wine, because the salt and the sweet bounce off each other in that way. Let's get this out. This is a bit ooey gooey. Matt, stick your finger in.
Yeah, if you want to taste a bad Matt,
Yeah.
which I think it's enlightening as the good ones,
Yeah.
is to try this or with one of the 2 dry reds we've got. They're just going to blow the red away. It's not nice.
Yeah.
So a cheese like this really needs a dessert wine, and what a special one this is. David, what is in this ice wine? What grape?
The grape variety is, I'd be surprised if anybody listening to this knows it right away, Fetiashka Regala. The regal, the royal Fetiashka. And anybody who's is big on their grape varieties would know that Fetiashka refers to a few different grape varieties growing in Romania. It's a Transylvanian ice wine. It's a project put together by Mr. Liliak and Gerhard Kracher of Austria, who is arguably a much better known figure in the wine world, having projects in his native Austria and a couple other places, including here across the border in Romania.
It's very pretty, very aromatic, a lot of laurel, peach, just a big, blousy aromatic nose, and then you get that lusciousness of on the palate from the sugar. As it's very lush, very plush, and I think a blue cheese is just the perfect match for it.
Yeah, it's not austere at all, is it?
No, but it's not unctuous. This is a very balanced sweet wine. I don't find it overly glycerined or horrible like that. I don't think it has any effect from botrytis. It doesn't have that. I don't have that palate feel that I would associate with a sweet wine that's been affected by botrytis.
Kate, I don't know how you feel about this, but when I was in high school, I had my first taste at my French teacher's house. And she was Egyptian. She wasn't French, but she was French speaking. And she started at Roquefort, and she, knowing that this was a bold cheese that would be hard for a 16-year-old palate, she started with butter. And she told us that if this cheese was strong, to mix it with a little bit of butter, and that would tone it down. And I've always thought that was a good tip when you have a particularly strong piece of blue.
Yes, that is good advice. I remember tasting it because at Neal's Yard we just dealt with British and Irish cheeses, and we had a customer called Mr. Arnold, who was also known as Mr. 6 ounces, because he put the fear of God into any cheesemonger to cut exactly 6 ounces of cheese. And we were all a bit frightened of him, honestly, but he proposed one day that we did just for staff and a few customers, nothing formal, but just cheese tasting with British and Irish cheeses, but also French. And he brought along some Roquefort. And what none of us knew, I'm talking about circa 1993 here, and a lot of very naive sort of young people, he had the most phenomenal wine collection, which he shared with us. And none of us, of course, were in a position to have had access to these wines, including a Madeira from the 1880s. And so we tried it with this Roquefort, and it was not often that we were rendered speechless, but we were on that occasion. It was remarkable. I think both you and I both have a similar Roquefort epiphany moment.
Yeah, it's wonderful cheese. I think it's a cheese that sometimes doesn't travel well.
Gosh, no. I have some horrible memory traveling back from France with the real deal back to the States and not securing its temperature. Ugh.
Yeah, but I also mean just when it shows up at a cheese shop, sometimes it's not in very good condition. So you really want to buy from a place like Talbott and Arding where they know their cheese, or be sure you taste before you buy, so you're not buying an overly strong.
Yeah, they can get really mushy and not nice.
What about the interaction? between the wine and the cheese.
To me, it's working. You have to have, I think with a cheese that's this bold and peppery, you have to have a sweet wine. It's going to blow away any dry wine. And this is a fun one. I think it's probably maybe my first, I know it's my first Romanian ice wine.
I think, trust me, it's pretty much everybody's first Romanian ice wine. I've had the pleasure of twice having visited Romania on wine business, touring a good percentage of this very large country, but not all of it by a long stretch. Tasting a great many of its wines and in equal measure being delighted and appalled. It's a country that is yet to really define itself fully about its capacity for making quality wines. But there are some bright stars. This is certainly one of them.
I just tasted the ice wine with the Omar. That's pretty damn good, I think.
I don't think you can go wrong with that, Omar.
No, because the butteriness really.
Janet, you have the wines lined up there, all 6 of them. I know there's some talk earlier on about going back and tasting some of the first cheeses with a couple of the dry reds. What are your takes on? I believe it was the Fleur de Maquis we talked about. Wanting to taste with either the DiMartino Cinsault or the Franc Pinot Noir.
Yeah, see what you think.
That you do. So that's why I was kicking it to you.
Well, we can.
We can do our best.
Yeah, I haven't done it, so let me find a fresh glass here and get a little bit of that on my glass. It might work. I tend to think when I get those herbaceous cheeses and I want a red, I think of more something like a Syrah that's got
a bit more heft.
Yeah, but let's give this a try. So we're going back to the Fleur de Maquis, which that has its wonderful herbaceous notes.
I still have a mouthful of Omar.
Life could be worse.
Yeah, definitely.
Deducing of and the enjoyment of wines with cheeses has gone to a different level here with my local Kate Arding of Talbott and Arding in Hudson, New York, and the estimable Janet Fletcher in Napa, California. Please, you have books, shops, events to promote. Please share with our audience how they should get in touch with your activities.
Yeah, you can find me on my website, janetfletcher.com, and I would love to have all your listeners as Planet Cheese readers. It's a once-a-week blog. It's free, of course.
It's fantastic.
And you can subscribe at any time. And I just try to cover the cheese world, what's new in cheese issues. As you mentioned, this week I introduced a new blue that's very exciting because it's quite unusual. I would love to have your listeners as Planet Cheese readers. I
also want to add that a lot of the cheesemongers and cheese industry people are hooked on Janet's blog. It's really good. I read it. It's one of my favorite things. So, I guess my turn. So if you happen to live in the New York State area, Hudson Valley area, or are up visiting Hudson for the weekend, we'd love to see you. It's 2 minutes walk from the train station in Hudson, and we have a cheese counter that I'm really proud of. Actually, I am. We have a great team there, very knowledgeable team. We also do a lot more than cheese. We do a lot of prepared food. So if you're coming up for your Airbnb for the weekend, you might want to stop off there. And we also do shipping. We do a lot of mail order too. We'd love to see you and talk cheese.
Talbott and Arding is most definitely a high-end, high-level, high-quality grocery purveyor, all sorts of things. You have lots of local Hudson Valley meats available last time I checked.
We do. Our main focus really is Hudson Valley, and then beyond that sort of regional, and then we plug certain gaps, especially on the cheese counter, with things such as this Manchego, which are imported, but we're very picky about who we buy from, and it's a lot of work presenting them in good condition, but that's what a good cheesemonger should do, and we're always happy to talk, as I say, cheese.
That said, I look forward to welcoming Kate and Janet back again for part 2, where we explore cheeses with beers, name of one of Janet's books, later this year. Thank you for joining Drinking on the Edge.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure.